In spite of the drought that has lasted for more than a year, we got a nice apple crop and now it's time to harvest. My plan is to make a small batch of applesauce and some apple cider vinegar with these apples. We'll see what else they become. I started picking the lower apples, or what was left of them. Because of the drought, the deer are hungry and have been coming up to the yard to eat what they can find. Not only have they eaten all the apples they can reach, they've been coming up and eating the chicken feed we put outside the chicken house. I got a new tool to help with picking fruit this year, and so far I'm really impressed. It has an 8-foot pole with a basket on the end to help me pick the fruit high above my head. A couple of years ago I made a homemade version of the fruit picker, and it worked pretty good until the trees got so tall my 4-foot stick wasn't long enough. This new tool keeps me off of ladders. I hate ladders, so I do love this new picker. We ended up with about a half a bushel of apples from our 2 apple trees, which is more than enough for the farmer and me to eat through the winter. There's a lot of bug damage to these apples, and I will have to process most of them because they won't last long if left raw. Growing your own food, especially organically, doesn't produce the pretty fruits and vegetables you get in the store. There will probably be bug damage, especially if the tree has had as much stress as ours have during the drought. Even though we watered them throughout the summer, the stress makes the trees more susceptible to pests. But there is so much fruit to be salvaged, so I cut off the bad spots to give to the horses. I didn't hear any complaints from them. I ended up with a large bowl of scraps to add to their breakfast and supper for 3 days. I wonder if they've hired the bugs to damage the apples. Because I'm going to use my Weston tomato press to make applesauce, I don't bother to peel the apples before I cook them. The saucer will take care of that for me. I use my apple slicer to simultaneously remove the core and cut the apples into slices. Then I inspect each slice for any damage I missed initially before putting them into the lemon water to keep the apples from browning. Browning won't hurt the nutrition of the applesauce I'm making, but it's not as pretty a product as if I use lemon water. After cutting the blossom end off the cores, I put them into a gallon jar. I will fill this jar 3/4 full with cores and apple chunks to make the apple cider. After I have a full pot of apple chunks, I add just enough water to cover the bottom of the pot so the apples don't stick as I cook them. I'm making a small batch of applesauce because neither the farmer nor I really like to eat applesauce. But I do like to use it to make apple breads and to substitute the oil in baking recipes. Did you know that you can substitute applesauce for oil 1-to-1 up to 1/4 cup? If your recipe calls for more than 1/4 cup of oil, use half oil and half applesauce. It takes about 20 minutes for the apples to cook down until they are soft. I stirred them often so they didn't stick. Then I turned off the fire and allowed them to cool down while I set up the saucer. I'm using the largest screen I have to process the apples into applesauce. I think the slightly chunky applesauce makes better apple bread. Once I run the apples through the saucer, I return it to the pot to bring it back to a boil. I'm using the Ball Complete Book of Home Preserving Applesauce recipe on page 182. It calls for 12 pounds of apples to make 8 pints, but I only need 3 or 4 pints, so I have 4 pounds of apples prepared and I adjust the recipe accordingly. Sugar is optional and I'm leaving it out. Whatever recipe I decide to use the applesauce in will have sugar, so I'm not putting it in now. Lemon juice is not optional. The lemon juice is added to ensure the applesauce has a high acid content to make it safe to water bath or steam can, so I added 2 tablespoons. Once the applesauce is boiling, I pack hot, clean jars to a 1/2 inch of headspace. Then I debubbled each jar and adjusted the headspace as needed. I got 3-pint jars out of this batch, which is perfect. Once I wiped each rim, added a lid and a ring tightened to finger tight only, I placed the jars in the steam canner I already had simmering. Then I put the lid on and turned up the heat to bring the water to a boil. Once the water was at a full boil and steam was escaping through the vent and around the edges of the lid at a constant rate, I set a timer for 10 minutes to get all of the air out of the canner and to fill the canner with steam. After 10 minutes passed, I set the timer for 20 minutes to process the jars. Once that time was over, I turned off the heat but left the lid on the canner for another 5 minutes. Then I removed the lid and waited another 5 minutes before removing the jars to a towel on the counter where they will set for the next 12 to 24 hours. In the meantime, I need to finish setting up the apple cider vinegar. I chunked up some more apples to get the gallon jar to 3/4 full of apples. Then I put a 1/4 cup of sugar on the apples and added water to just cover everything. Apple cider vinegar is made by the fermentation by yeast, and to get it started, the yeast needs some sugar to eat. The first step is for the yeast to turn the sugar, both the granulated and that in the apples, to alcohol. This will take about 2 to 3 weeks. I will strain the fruit out in about 2 weeks. The second stage of fermentation will turn the alcohol into vinegar. After the fruit is strained out and the liquid is transferred back into the jar, the yeast will continue to process the sugars until the final product is apple cider vinegar. This final process will take another 3 to 4 weeks to achieve. My goal is to get a vinegar with a pH of 3.0 to 3.5, which I can determine with pH paper. But I can't determine the percentage of vinegar without expensive lab equipment, so I won't be using this vinegar for canning, but I can use it for cooking and making salad dressings and for cleaning. For making pickles, I will only use vinegar from the store that has been tested to be 5%. Once I have everything together, I place a plastic lid that fits down into the jar and completely covers the fruit. I then put a weight on top of that lid to keep everything under the water. The fruit must stay submerged beneath the water to make sure mold doesn't form. This would ruin the vinegar. The yeast needs air to process the vinegar, so I don't put a lid on the jar, but I do want to keep dust out, so I cover the jar with a coffee filter and secure it with a rubber band. I will keep the jar in the pantry, which is cool and dark, while the yeast does its work. My final project for today is making freeze-dried apples that we like to snack on. I have loaded the trays with a single layer of apple slices and will get these into the freeze dryer. Does anyone else think that arranging food on a freeze dryer tray is a bit like playing Tetris? Thanks for stopping by the Old Mayfield place today. Stay healthy. How are you going to preserve your apples? And have a blessed week.